Hey guys, welcome to week 7 of distance learning. We officially have only 5 weeks left in the school year before you guys are 7th graders. So I just wanted to start by saying congratulations to everybody who has been working really hard to make distance learning work. I'm super proud of you guys. This week I think I had more of you turn stuff in than ever before. My first period, congratulations, you guys turned stuff in the fastest. But based on overall percentages, my 7th and 8th period, you guys are the ones that have the most people turning stuff in. So just a little friendly competition. 5th period, still waiting for you guys to pick up the pace a little bit. As always, if you guys are not doing the work, you can expect for me to be calling home to check in on you guys just to make sure everything's okay. And that you don't need like a laptop or something because the school still does have some of those. For this week, I'm so excited because we're doing our novels that you guys picked. So by now you already know what group you're in, and you already know what book you're reading, and you know what pages you're reading. So for this week, it'll be the same thing as always. You'll do a little quick write, and then you will have 2 assignments. The first one, you're going to be responding to a question about making connections to the text that you're reading, the book that you're reading. And the second assignment is going to be really cool because I'm going to post discussion questions in our Google Classroom. So right next to where you see the assignment, there's going to be a different discussion prompt for each book. So if you're reading Holes, you'll go to the one for Holes and you'll respond to it. And your 2 grades for this week, just to clarify, one is going to be the work you do in the Google Slides and you'll type your responses. That's grade 1. Grade 2 is going to be your response to the discussion question. So the really cool thing about this is I really want it to be a discussion, and I don't want you guys to just be putting an answer and then not looking at it again. So part of the grade is going to be, did you respond to at least one of your classmates' responses? Because I really want to get kind of a dialogue conversation going about around the books. So you'll do the quick write real quick. You will do the making connections, grade 1, and then grade 2, you will be doing that discussion post that you will find. And if you have trouble locating it or you need any help, you can always just leave a comment on the Google Slides and I'll see it immediately and I'll respond and let you know where you can go. So that should be really fun. We're going to do that every week. So every week, whatever book you're reading, you'll have a different little post and you'll be talking on that post with your friends who are reading the same book in your class. And eventually I would like to do one where we get to talk to the kids in other classes who are reading the same book. So we're working on that as a team. So you guys can maybe get with Miss Redgate's and Miss Foster's and Miss Guerra's and Miss Ralston's and Mr. Padilla's groups as well and see what they think if they're reading Walk Two Moons, like are they having the same experience as you guys? So have kind of like a pen pal program towards the end of the book. So that should be something to look forward to. That is pretty much it. I'm going to be sending out an email, just a heads up to you guys, if you have any missing work from week 5 or week 6, or this upcoming week 7, if you have any missings in the grade book, I'm going to be emailing your parents to let them know because you can still make up those grades, but the missings count as a 0. So if you have not logged in for the past 2 weeks, your average for this 6 weeks is a 0. And I know that none of you guys are 0 students. I don't teach any F students. All of you guys have the ability to do really good jobs. So please double check if you're not sure. You can log into the hack system and the grades are all updated, so you should be able to see. Another thing is I do leave comments on everything I grade, so if you want feedback and you're like, I don't really know why I got a 50 on this, go to the assignment and look in the comments and I will tell you what you were missing so you can fix it, or if you don't want to bring your grade up, you can always just do it again for next time. I think that's it for the work. I'm really proud of you guys. I already said that, but I mean it. I'm just amazed by all the great work you're continuing to do. I love it when you guys put pictures of your pets in the Google Slides next to the quick write or pictures of stuff you cooked. That's been really fun. I thought I'd share, I finished a book and I put it in the presentation so you can see it, but I'm about to start this book that Miss Foster recommended to me. It's got a really cool cover, which is kind of the reason that I got it, but hopefully it's going to be good. She said it was pretty good, so that should be fun. And then also your co-teacher Mars has been eating all of our houseplants. So I finally found a houseplant that he won't eat, and I thought I would share my new plant with you guys too. He will not eat the cactus. So that's been a fun little adventure for us, right, buddy? Anyway, he's also very proud of you, and he says, don't forget to do your work this week. All right, here's the novel, guys. Joseph, just outside Havana Harbor, 1939, 18 days from home. Help, my dad jumped overboard. Help, Joseph cried. Far below him, already a couple 100 yards away from the ship, Joseph's father thrashed crazily in the water. He screamed incoherently, but he wasn't calling out for rescue. On the decks below, passengers ran to the rails and pointed. The ship's siren continued to blow and sailors ran about, but nobody was doing anything. Joseph spun around helplessly. What was he supposed to do? Jump in after his father? It was such a long way down, and he didn't know how to swim. Down below on the sea deck, one of the Cuban policemen tossed his cap and gun belt aside, kicked off his shoes, and jumped headlong into the green water. He hit the ocean with a slap and a splash, and for many seconds Joseph held his breath as though he were the diver himself. Joseph's lungs were just about to burst when the man broke the surface a few yards away from where he'd hit, gasping for breath. The man flipped the wet hair out of his face, spun until he had his bearings, and set off swimming for Joseph's father. Joseph's heart raced as fast as his feet as he flew down the stairs. He pushed through the crowds and ran to the rail, but the policeman hadn't yet reached his father. A woman screamed, and Joseph followed the pointing fingers. 2 shark fins had appeared in the water. Joseph froze in terror. There were more screams as his papa sank beneath the waves, and Joseph had to cling to the rail not to collapse. One of the St. Louis's lifeboats hit the water, and the ship's siren had brought motor launches from the shore, but none of them were going to be in time. The only person close enough to save Joseph's father was the Cuban policeman. Even though the shark still circled, the policeman took a deep breath and dived beneath the waves. Joseph counted the long seconds before the man broke the surface again, this time with Papa in his arms. The passengers on the ship cheered, but Joseph's father didn't want to be rescued. He struggled in the man's arms, beating and flailing at him. "Murderers!" he cried. "They'll never take me." But Papa was weak and the policeman was strong. One of the motor launches from shore reached them first, and the policeman helped the other men lift Joseph's father into the boat. Let me die, Joseph's father cried. The words struck Joseph like slaps to the face, and tears sprang to his eyes. His father would rather die than be with his son, his daughter, his wife. The crack of a pistol shot made Joseph jump. One of the men in the boat stood aiming a gun down into the water near the policeman. Pack, pack! He shot twice more, and one of the shark fins turned away from the policeman to attack the shark the man had wounded with his pistol. The men laid Joseph's father in the bottom of the boat and helped the weary policeman aboard. There were sighs of relief and whispered prayers on the St. Louis, but Joseph's heart lurched when he saw his father kick away the man trying to help him. Papa lunged for the side of the small boat, trying to get back to the sea. Let me die, he cried out again. The policeman grabbed him and pulled him back in the boat. 2 more of the men restrained him, and the boat quickly turned and sped toward the shore. The St. Louis's siren stopped blasting, and suddenly it was over. All around Joseph, passengers wept. But now Joseph felt more stunned than sad. His father was gone. In many ways, his father had never really come back from the concentration camp. Not the father Joseph knew and remembered. Not the father he loved. He had come back in body, but not in spirit. Joseph's father was gone. His mother was unconscious. His little sister was all by herself, and they would never let Joseph's family into Cuba now, not after his father had gone mad. Joseph and his family would all be sent back to Germany, back to the Nazis. Joseph's world was falling apart, and he didn't see any way to put it back together again. Isabel, summer between the Bahamas and Florida, 1994, 4 days from home. The little boat was falling apart. The seams between the sides had cracks in them. The engine rattled in its mounting, constantly weakening the bolts that held it in place. Even the benches were coming loose. Only Castro hadn't cracked. He stared up at Isabel as stern and confident as ever, commanding her to fight against the impossible and win. But it was hard to fight against the inevitable. The water in the boat was almost to Isabel's knees. She and the others worked sluggishly in the blazing hot Caribbean sun to scoop, pitch, but water was seeping in as fast as they could bail it. The boat was sinking. Every empty water bottle and gasoline can had been tucked up under a bench to help keep them afloat, but if they didn't reach Florida soon, they were all going to drown. Fight against the impossible and win, Isabel told herself. When are we going to get there? Yvonne whined. Mañana, Lito said wearily. Mañana. Suddenly, Isabel's grandfather stopped bailing water. He sat up straighter, like he was looking at something in the distance. Mañana, he whispered. Lito? Isabel asked. Her grandfather blinked and his eyes found her again. Was he crying or was it just sweat and seawater? It's nothing, Chabela, just a memory. Something I hadn't thought about in a long time. Isabel's grandfather gazed around the little boat and his eyes suddenly looked sadder, Isabel thought. She would have crawled over and hugged him, but there was no room to do it without 3 people getting up and moving for her to get there. Don't stop bailing, Senor Castillo told them from where he lay in the bottom of the boat. Maybe you could help, Poppy told him. I'm recovering, Senor Castillo argued. I can barely move in this heat. Besides, I don't see you bailing. I'm tending to my wife, Poppy said, who's really sick. Ever since the Bahamas, something had come over Isabel's father. He'd been more attentive to Mommy, more focused on her than anything else. Nobody else noticed, but Isabel did. She'd seen him hold her hand, watched him gently move her hair out of her face, heard him whispering that he loved her, that he needed her. Things she had never seen or heard him do before. Are you saying my father is faking it? Louise challenged. I'm just saying it's very nice for him that everybody else is keeping this metal coffin afloat while he sits back and relaxes, Poppy said. You wouldn't even have this metal coffin if I hadn't built it. I'm not sure if built is the right word, Senora Castillo said, trying to pull 2 of the side pieces back together. Cobbled is more like it. Ivan and Senor Castillo erupted at the same time. We did the best we could, Ivan yelled. Oh, now you're telling us how to build things, Senor Castillo said. Where were you and Luis when we were up all night putting this thing together, eh? You were at your law office, doing God knows what. Isabel shrank in her seat and put her hands over her ears. She hated when her parents argued like this, and now everyone on the boat was mad at each other. I was helping people, Senor Castillo told her husband. You've never appreciated what I do. And what was I supposed to do, Luis threw in? Tell my police commander I had to stay home and build a raft so I could escape? All of you stop it, Amara yelled from the back of the boat. Right now. You're acting like children. Everyone fell quiet and looked appropriately chastised. I think it's time for a water break, Amara told them. Isabel, will you hand out the bottles? It was a little earlier than their rationed water break, but none of them complained. The clear, delicious water was the best thing Isabel had ever tasted, and it settled them all down like mother's milk for a baby. We're all hot and we're all tired, and yes, we're sinking, Amara said. But if we lose our heads, we're only going to die faster. We can resolve this. She's right, Isabel's father said. I'm sorry. I'm sorry too, Senor Castillo said. I should be helping. Only if you're up to it, Poppy said, and he sounded like he meant it. The boat is falling apart, though, Ivan said. We're taking on too much water. We have too much weight, Senor Castillo said. She was right, but what could they lose? There was just the engine, the fuel, the food and water, and the 9 of them. What if 1 or 2 of us slipped out into the water at a time, Poppy suggested. They could hang on to the boat. Floating in the water alongside would help take some of the weight away. But it would drag on the boat, slow us down, Louise said. But it might keep the boat afloat longer, Senor Castillo said. I think we should try it, Amara said. We'll take turns in the water. It'll keep us cooler, too. And right now, Isabel thought, cooler heads just might be the most important thing of all. Mehmood, somewhere on the Mediterranean Sea, 2015, 11 days from home. Mehmood was in and out of sleep, waking every few seconds when the waves washed over him. Minutes, hours passed, and Mehmood dreamed that a boat was coming for them. He could hear its motor over the lapping of the waves. Mehmood jerked awake. He ran a wet, cold hand down his face, trying to focus, and he heard it again. The sound of a motor. He wasn't dreaming, but where was it? The rain had stopped, but it was still dark. He couldn't see the boat, but he could hear it. Here, he cried, here! But the sound of the motor still stayed frustratingly, agonizingly far away. If only whoever was on the boat could see him, Mahmoud thought. All his life he'd practiced being hidden, unnoticed. Now, at last, when he most needed to be seen, he was truly invisible. Mahmoud cried in exhaustion and misery. He wanted to do it all over again. He wanted to go back and stand up for the boy in the alley in Aleppo who's getting beaten up for his bread. To scream and yell and wake the sleeping citizens of Izmir so they would see him and all the other people sleeping in doorways and parks. To tell Bashir al-Assad and his army to go to hell. He wanted to stop being invisible and stand up and fight. But now he would never get a chance to do any of that. It was too late. There was no time. Time. The phone! Mahmoud still had the phone in his pocket. He pulled it out and pushed the button on it through the plastic bag, and the screen with the clock on it lit up like a beacon in the night. Mahmoud held it over his head and waved it in the dark, screaming and yelling for help. The motor got louder. Mahmoud wept for joy as a boat emerged from the darkness, a real boat this time, not a dinghy. A speedboat with lights and antennas and blue and white stripes on the side, the colors of the Greek flag. A Greek Coast Guard ship come to save them. And on the front of the ship, down on his knees with hands clasped in thanks, was Mahmoud's father. Walid was there too, in the back under a foil thermal blanket, and soon Mahmoud and his mother were out of the water and wrapped in the foil blankets too. What little body heat they still had left reflected back at them. Mahmoud's mother was too insensible to speak, so Mahmoud told his father how they had given Hana away rather than see her drown with them. Mahmoud's father wept, but pulled Mahmoud to him and hugged him. Hana's not with us, but she's alive. I know it, his father told him. Because of you, my son. The Greek Coast Guard boats swept through the choppy Mediterranean the rest of the night, pulling more people out of the water. The Coast Guard finally sent Mahmoud and his family and all the other refugees down on the island of Lesbos. It was almost 6 o'clock in the morning and the sky was beginning to lighten with the dawn. Mahmoud wasn't sure, but he thought he and his mother had spent more than 2 hours in the water. When they stepped off the boat, Mahmoud's father got down on his hands and knees and kissed the ground and gave thanks to Allah. It was time for morning prayers anyway, and Mahmoud joined him. When they were finished, Mahmoud staggered up the rocky gray shore, squinting at the hills that rose just beyond the beach. Then he realized they weren't real hills. They were piles and piles of life jackets. There were mountains of them, stretching up and down the coast as far as Mahmoud could see. The way Aleppo had its piles of rubble, Lesbos had its piles of life jackets, abandoned by the hundreds of thousands of refugees who had come before them, shedding the vests that they no longer needed and moving along on the road to somewhere else. There were bodies on the beach, too. People who hadn't survived the sea and the night, who hadn't been found by the Coast Guard in time. Men mostly, but a few women, too, and a child. Mahmoud's mother rushed to the infant, howling Hana's name. Mahmoud hurried after her, horrified, but the child wasn't Hana. It was someone else's baby daughter, her lungs filled with seawater. Mahmoud's mother cried into his shoulder until a Greek man in a uniform moved them both away from the body and recorded the infant in a little notebook, tallying the daily dead. Mahmoud staggered away, feeling as numb as if he were in the freezing water again. Mahmoud's mother went to all the other refugees who had landed in the night and were still there, asking each of them if they had seen her little Hana, but none of them had. The boat with Mahmoud's little sister on it was gone. It had either reached the island and its passengers had already moved on, or it too had wrecked on these rocks. Mahmoud's mother fell to her knees on the rocky ground and wept, and Mahmoud's father held her close and let her cry. Mahmoud felt gutted. It was all his fault. Hana might still be with him if he hadn't gotten someone on that boat to take her. Or she might have died during their 2 hours in the water. Either way, they'd lost her. Mahmoud, his father said quietly over his sobbing shoulder, check the other bodies and see if they have any shoes that will fit us. Josef, just outside Havana Harbor, 1939, 19 days from home. Josef wished he was invisible. Once the rest of the passengers discovered who had jumped overboard yesterday, everyone stopped to tell him how sorry they were, how everything would be all right. But how could it be all right? How could it ever be all right? Josef stood at the rail on A deck where his father had jumped. Down below, the sea was no longer empty. It was dotted with little motorboats and rowboats. Some carried reporters shouting up questions and trying to get pictures of the ship. Other boats offered up bunches of fresh bananas and bags of coconuts and oranges. Passengers on C deck tossed money down, and the fruit was passed up the ladder by the Cuban policemen guarding the top and the bottom. Lately, though, the boats were full of relatives of people on board. Mostly men, they had come ahead to Cuba to get jobs and find places for their families to live. One man brought the same little white dog every day and held it up for his wife to wave to. The boats with relatives came close enough for their families to yell back and forth a little, but they couldn't get any closer. Thanks to Joseph's father, a handful of Cuban police boats now surrounded the St. Louis. They kept the rescue ships at a distance and watched for anyone else who tried to jump to freedom or death. At night, the Cuban police boats swept the hull with searchlights, and the St. Louis's crew members, on the captain's orders, patrolled the decks on suicide watch. "Evelyn, there he is! There's Papa!" Renata cried. She stood a few paces away from Josef down the rail, trying to point out one of the little rowboats to her sister. "Where? I don't see him," Evelyn whined. Josef was more interested in the small police boat that had navigated its way through the flotilla and was pulling up to the St. Louis. Anytime they had a visitor now, it was cause for conversation, and soon word spread throughout the ship that the boat had brought the Cuban policeman who had saved Josef's father. Josef ran down to fetch his mother and sister, and together they hurried to the social hall, where a group of passengers and crew gathered to give the Cuban policeman a hero's welcome. They parted for the policeman, cheering and slapping him on the back and shaking hands with him as he went. It was the first time he had been back to the ship since jumping overboard to save Joseph's father, and Josef and his family strained to get a good look at him over the heads of the other passengers. Joseph's mother cried and put a hand to her mouth, and Josef felt a surge of affection for the policeman. This was the man who had saved his father's life. The policeman seemed genuinely flattered and surprised by all the attention. He was a short, stocky man with olive skin, a wide face, and a thick mustache. He wore blue pants, a gray shirt with epaulets on the shoulders, and a matching gray beret. Around his waist was a leather belt with a nightstick and holster hanging from it. His name, they were told, was Mariano Padron. Captain Schroeder arrived to thank Officer Padron on behalf of all of the passengers and crew. Josef felt a ripple of tension spread throughout the room. Josef had seen the captain less and less as the hot days of waiting at anchor dragged on. He wasn't the only passenger who had noticed. But they were there to celebrate Officer Padron, not badger the captain about why they were still on the ship. The mood became happy again when the policeman was presented with a gift of 150 Reichsmarks that had been collected from grateful passengers. Officer Padron was stunned, and so was Josef. 150 Reichsmarks was a lot of money, especially for people who might need that money later to pay for visas and entrance fees. Officer Padron tried to refuse the money, but the passengers wouldn't hear of it. "I was just doing my job," Officer Padron told the audience through a translator, "but I will never forget this. I will never forget any of you. Thank you." The passengers applauded again, and while many of them turned their attention to the captain to ask for a status report, Josef and his mother and sister pushed forward to talk to the policeman. Officer Padron's eyes lit up at the sight of Josef's mother. He said something in Spanish, and the passenger who had spoken for him in front of the crowd smiled and translated his words. "Senora, your father was a thief?" Josef's mother frowned. "A thief? My father? No, I don't understand." "Your father, he must be a thief," Officer Padron said through the translator, "because he stole the stars from the sky and put them in the senora's eyes." Josef finally understood. It was some kind of compliment about how pretty she was. His mother smiled politely but impatiently. "Officer Padron, what about my husband?" she asked. "Is he all right? They won't let me go ashore and see him." The policeman took off his hat. "I am so sorry, so very sorry. Senora Landau, yes, your husband is alive," he said through the interpreter. "He is in the hospital. He has been..." Officer Padron said something more, but the translator frowned. It was beyond his limited Spanish. Officer Padron could see his confusion, and he pantomimed what he meant by turning his wrists upside down, closing his eyes, and lolling his head back like he was asleep. "Sedated," Mom said. There was pain in her voice. Josef knew she blamed herself. The whole reason her husband was gone was because she had been sedated and unable to stop him. Officer Padron nodded. "It's not good," he said through the interpreter, "but he will live." Josef's mother took both of the policeman's hands in her own and kissed them. "Thank you, Officer Padron." She spoke in German, but the policeman seemed to understand. He blushed and nodded. Then he spied Ruthie, half hidden behind her mother's skirts, and knelt down to her. He put his policeman's beret on her head and said something in Spanish, and she smiled. "He says you're the policewoman now," the translator said. "He will be the criminal. You must catch him." Officer Padron led Ruthie on a merry chase around the room, Ruthie squealing. Josef's mother laughed through a sob. It was the first time Josef had heard her laugh or seen her smile in months. Officer Padron let Ruthie catch him, and he plucked the hat off Ruthie's head and put it on Josef's head, speaking in Spanish again. "He says it's your turn." "Oh no," Josef said. He waved a hat to make sure the policeman understood. He wasn't in the mood for fun and games, and besides, he was too old for that kind of thing. Officer Padron tapped Josef's chest with the back of his hand, urging him to play. "He says he is the passenger," the translator said. Officer Padron raised himself up in mock anger and spoke in Spanish. "You, senor policeman," the translator said. "When will we leave the ship?" The happy mood suddenly disappeared. Josef and his family and the translator looked at each other awkwardly. Officer Padron had only meant to mimic what everyone asked him all the time, but the question made Josef sag. It felt like they were never getting off the ship. Officer Padron realized his mistake, and immediately he looked anguished at having brought it up. He nodded in sympathy. Then in unison, he and Josef spoke the answer all the Cuban guards always gave. "Mañana."